Hi, my name is Lori. I'll wait till they're done, that's okay. Okay, my name is still Lori, and I'm going to talk about some history with hats, as well as some of the hats in my collection. And we're going to start at this end. When I was 11 years old, I read a book about a boy that always wore different hats. And I probably have about 15 different children's books regarding, believe it or not, guys and women that wear hats. And then my parents took my brother and I down to Disney, and they bought me a pair of Mickey Mouse ears. And I decided that was going to be the first hat in my collection. Now, over 50 years later, I do have over 500 pieces of headwear. Wow. Hats first came about to protect us from the elements, but they've been around for a very long time. There was a drawing on a tomb wall in Thebes, Egypt. It dates back to 3,100 years ago, and it showed a man wearing a conical-shaped straw hat. And then does anyone here remember in 1991 the discovery of Otzi, the Iceman? Yes. Okay. Otzi was found in between the Austrian and Italian Alps. He's Europe's most well-preserved frozen mummy. And Otzi, I bring him up because he dates to between 3,100 and 3,400 BC. And he was wearing a bearskin hat. So as you can see, hats have been along for a long time. First, they came about to protect us from the elements, the wind, the rain, the sun. And over time, they've come to represent fashion, style. And when my kids were growing up, this was their favorite hat because it did this.
Oh, that's neat.
So hats also are for fun.
Wow. What is that made out of? Is it plastic?
It's like a cardboard, hard paper type of thing. Yeah.
Wow. That is. That's fun.
And of course, there's Schlitz beer hats and airline pilots, train conductor, police. Remember when nurses wore these?
Yes.
And when McDonald's workers wore these? Could you see getting a kid today to put one of these on when they're flipping burgers?
Wow.
I do like to always point out the fire helmet, because although the materials have changed over the years, the back and the design has stayed the same. The elongated back is to help protect these men and women, and they're out in the elements with the wind and the sun, the rain, and that's to help keep it off the backs of their necks.
And what's inside?
Well, this is an old leather one with the lining in it.
Oh, okay.
But nowadays they're made from a different material.
Oh, really?
But this is very old here. Now I walked a mail route for 27 years, and I retired 2 years ago. And of course, we were issued these. There's not a lot of protection in the elements with this. In fact, many days I wish they'd offer this.
Yes.
So before I get into a lot of the history, I'm going to share with you the story of how I got my French mail carrier's hat.
Wow.
My daughter and I were on vacation in France, and I brought with me a United States hat, hoping to trade it for a French mail carrier's hat. So we went into a post office, and I asked the clerk if there was a mail carrier there, and told her I wanted to trade hats. And she said, that's impossible. It's against the rules. It's in the manual. They're not allowed to sell or transfer any part of their uniform. So we left the post office. A few days later, we were in a different area, and I went into another post office. Basically the same story. I asked about the French mail hat, and she said, no, it's against the rules. It's in their manual. They're not allowed to get rid of any part of their uniform. So the very last day of the trip, we're in a little village called Roanne, and my daughter sees a mail carrier. So we went up to him, and I can speak a little bit of French. I said, bonjour, je suis un facteur États-Unis, which is, hi, I'm a mail carrier in the United States. Well, I think he thought I was his long-lost sister. He hugged me, he kissed me on each cheek. I then explained to him that I would love his hat for my collection. And lucky for me, he didn't read the manual. He just reached in and handed me his hat, which was in his little cot. I then gave him the United States hat. But 2 more times throughout the day, my daughter and I were walking around, And we see this French mail carrier in full uniform with the United States of America on his head. So that's one of the reasons why I still collect them, because it's fun stories and you meet different people. The other reason is the history. I love history. My dad, I think, would have killed my brother and I if we didn't do well in history. And so I'm going to talk about some of the iconic pieces of headwear that have been around for hundreds of years and are still around today. So these are the scally cap, newsboy, flat cap style. The scally caps date back to the 1300s. Wow. Now in 1571, Parliament passed a law that every male over the age of 6, except for royalty, had to wear a woolen cap on Sundays and holidays or they'd face a fine.
When was this, excuse me?
That was in 1571 in England, or they'd face a fine. So the men, of course, wore the hats, and that took about 25 years and that law was repealed. But the gentlemen were used to wearing that type of hat. The only reason it was even implemented was to promote the wool trade. Now, when a lot of those Irish immigrants came to America, they brought the scally cap style with them. A lot of those immigrants worked along the docks and the shipyards, and they started getting a negative reputation, fighting, gambling, drinking. So people began referring to them as scallywags, and scallywags wore scally caps.
Oh.
And that's, so if you see a gentleman wearing one like this, you'll know he's trouble. The second hat I like to talk about is one of my favorites. It is a top hat, and just to show you how important headwear was to the people then, this is from the 1800s. This is a top hat leather case, and that's another case for a hat there, but the top hat in 1793, there was a gentleman by the last name of Dunnage in England, and he was a hatter. Hatters make men's hats, and milliners make women's hats. You can be a man, but if you make a woman's hat, you're called a milliner. So a hatter named Dunnage designed this type of style of hat, but nothing really came about from it. But then in 1797, there was a gentleman named John Heathington. And Mr. Heathington was a hatter in England. He designed a top hat. He wore it out of his shop down the main streets of London. It says that he caused such a commotion, he was stopped and fined by a police officer for disturbing the peace.
Oh my goodness.
But there was also a reporter for the London Times that witnessed the whole event. He wrote it up on the front page of the Times with a photo as well. And the rest, as they say, was history. Wow. Anybody that was anybody wanted a top hat. Of course, they were very expensive. They were first made from beaver fur. But if you can think in U.S. history, can you think of maybe a president that wore a top hat? Lincoln, exactly. Our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, wore a top hat. He was a lawyer by trade. He would put his important papers up inside his hat. Now, in 1865, when he was assassinated, the War Department, with his wife Mary's permission, took possession of a lot of his belongings, including his hat. And it took about 2 years, but they donated it to the Smithsonian Institute. And the gentleman, the curator at the Smithsonian, still felt it was too soon to put it out on display. So it sat in a basement cabinet for about 24 years. And it was lent out for an exhibit about Lincoln and eventually returned and put on display, which is where it is today. Now, every U.S. president, up to and including Kennedy, wore a top hat for his presidential inauguration, except for Eisenhower before him. And Kennedy's top hat, in fact, is on display. If any of you ever been to the Kennedy Museum, it's a pretty interesting place, and his top hat is on display there. J.P. Morgan had a specially built limousine with a taller roof, so he could ride in it with his top hat on. And on September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese boarded the USS Missouri to sign surrender papers after the war, every non-military member of that Japanese delegation wore a top hat. Uncle Sam wore a top hat. And of course, you can't talk about a top hat unless you talk about the Mad Hatter. Right. So the numbers on the side of his hat supposedly referred to the price, 10 shillings and 6 pence. Oh. Now, the term mad as a hatter, I heard somebody mention it earlier. That actually, it dates back to a time in Turkey initially when they were making hats out of camel fur. And believe it or not, they were using the camel's urine to cure that fur, to help intertwine it together and to make the hat. That process with the urine and the fur made its way over to Europe and England, and eventually the hatters were using other materials. They were using beaver, they were using rabbit, and they were using their own urine. So these hatters were using their urine to make the hats, and in a factory in France, management noticed there was one worker that was working at a much quicker rate. Well, when they looked into it, he was being treated for syphilis, and part of the component of his medication involved mercury. So out with the urine, in with the mercury. And now the hatters were using mercury in the felting process to make hats. Well, they're in windowless buildings, there's no ventilation, they're literally poisoning themselves. And over time, they began shaking, forgetting things, and the term mad as a hatter. And in Danbury, Connecticut, which was a huge hat capital, they were also, same process obviously, and the term there was called the Danbury Shakes in Danbury, Connecticut. But that was outlawed, that process, in Europe in the late 1800s. We continued it in the United States until 1941, when mercury was finally outlawed in hat making. They were using it for detonators at that point in the war. But that's that term. Now, in 1814, there was a famous magician named Louis Comte. And Louis Comte had his own theater. He did performances for the king. And it would have been, he's credited as being the first magician to be on stage with a top hat and saying the words, "Watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat." See, there's a magic show too. In 1840, there was a gentleman named Antoine Gibbis. And Mr. Gibbis loved his top hat, but he didn't like the idea that he'd wear it out to the opera, the theater, and it was very cumbersome. He had to hold it throughout the performance. So Mr. Gibbis decided to modify the top hat, and he put springs in it. So you could now drop it down.
That's pretty cool.
And it was called an opera hat or a gibbous. And they actually, some of the theaters have the metal brackets under the seats, so now you slide it underneath. And I did a talk a few weeks ago and was talking about this, and that night, I don't know if anyone here watches Chronicle. I watch that sometimes, and that night, they showed an old theater that had the metal brackets under the seats, and they talked about it. And then this one is just, it's the same thing, but if anyone wanted to look after, you can actually see the metal pieces inside. In 1849, there was a wealthy landowner, also in England, and he wanted the men that worked for him to dress properly. And to him, that meant wearing a top hat. But these men are riding horseback there, mending fences, taking care of the livestock. So a top hat wasn't the most conducive hat for that. It was getting knocked off by branches, trampled by the horses. So this gentleman, his last name was Locke. He went to Locke and Company, which is the oldest hat company in the world. It's on St. James Place in England. And the gentleman's last name was Cook, but it was pronounced C-O-K-E. So Mr. Cook went to Locke and Company, and he requested a hat be made specifically for him, for his riders, that could sit lower on the head and had a sturdy crown. And they gave the job to two brothers whose last name was Bowler. And the bowler was born. Now the bowler, believe it or not, this is considered the hat that won the West, not the cowboy hat. If you look at some of the old westerns on TV, you remember, think in your head, you can think of the shopkeepers, the bankers, the good guys, right? Bat Masterson wore a bowler. But then the bad guys, like Butch Cassidy, also wore a bowler. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, wore a bowler. And then just wanted to show you this case. So it's all silk lined, and it's just amazing how they took care of their items. And the strap at the other end is where the gentleman would put his gloves. Now the bowler, okay, one of my favorite stories for the bowler was in the early 1920s. There were a group of British railroad workers in Bolivia laying railroad track. A lot of bowlers were shipped to them for these gentlemen because, again, cowboy hat wasn't invented yet. This was the hat of the times, even in early 1920s. Well, when the bowlers arrived, they were too small for the gentleman's head. So what do you do with all these bowlers? You tell the Quechuan women of the area that this is high fashion in England.
Oh my goodness.
And they sold out and continued to sell out. So this is a current day photo, and you can see these Quechuan women in their dresses and beautiful skirts, and they're all wearing bowlers. So I thought that was a pretty good marketing ploy. Now, so we've talked about some of the men's headwear into the early 1920s. What were the women wearing? A lot of the women, of course, were wearing bonnets. Nothing that exciting. It kept the wind out of their hair and the dirt out of their hair. And they also wore, and the bonnets, of course, were different materials and different colors, but it was still a bonnet. But they also wore an item. This is the oldest piece in my collection. I just keep it in this box. But they wore something called a calash. And a calash is a bonnet, but it expanded to fit over the woman's wigs of the time. So this hat is from 1790. So this is over 200 years old. And this is a calash. And what they did was put wood or whalebone in them so they would expand like this.
Oh, great. Wow.
So this was, again, to fit over the wigs at the time. I mean, you can see how very old it is. And again, this one is wood.
Gee, amazing.
I mean, over 200 years old. Now, I had done a talk for the Eustis Estate in Milton for Historic New England, and the curator afterwards toured me to their facility in Haverhill. It was amazing. It's all this history from New England dating back hundreds of years. I mean, it was furniture and it was artwork and jewelry and clothing. And she was telling me that they had an appraiser come in and was supposed to be appraising some items for them. But when they were walking through the furniture section, the appraiser stopped and asked the curator, "Why is this item here?" And the curator said, "Well, someone donated the hood to a baby carriage, but not the carriage." And exactly. And the woman said, "No, that's a calash. That is headwear." So they, of course, moved it into the headwear and dress department. But it was this very large calash. It was amazing. It was huge. I couldn't believe how big it was. But they thought they had the hood to a baby carriage. In the times when, of course, there was no heat in the homes, women and men wore nightcaps to bed. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with the term, "let's have a nightcap before we go to bed." That's where the term comes from. They were put on to warm you at night, and hence you have the nightcap to warm you before you go to bed. Isn't this cool stuff? Now, in addition to bonnets, women and men were also wearing straw hats. This one, are you familiar with, I know we're about an hour away, but Foxborough, Massachusetts, where the Patriots play? Okay, this hat is from Foxborough. It's over 100 years old. Foxborough, Massachusetts, at one point in time, was the straw hat capital of the world, not just New England or the world. So this fact was attributed to a 12-year-old girl in 1798. Her name was Betsy Metcalf. Betsy actually lived in Rhode Island, but she saw a straw hat in the window. Of course, she couldn't afford it, a straw bonnet. So she taught herself how to braid straw from her father's fields until she made a bonnet that she felt was presentable, and she wore it to her day school in Rentham. Well, her classmates loved the hat. They asked her to teach them how to make this bonnet, which she did. And a lot of those young girls lived in Foxborough, Massachusetts. This is a time, remember, when women couldn't own property, they couldn't have their own money, and here they were making these straw hats. And there was a gentleman in town by the last name of Carpenter. He was buying up the hats, taking them into Boston, and selling out on a daily basis. So literally, a cottage industry sprang up. These girls and then other women were learning this weaving process, if you will, and making headwear. Eventually, he built a giant factory building and employed hundreds of women, and they made thousands of these hats. And again, it attributed to them being considered the straw hat capital of the world, right here in Massachusetts. Now, that was in 1798. Not that many years later, in 1809, there was a woman in Connecticut named Mary Kice. Mary braided straw with silk, and she decided to apply for a patent. Now, women couldn't own property, but there was no law that said a woman couldn't have a patent. So she applied for and was granted the first patent in the United States for a woman, and it was for weaving straw with silk to make a hat. In fact, President Madison's wife sent her a thank you letter for bringing women into the forefront of industry.
Wow.
Now, I think I heard someone else mentioning also earlier, but in the late 1800s, there were many milliners on the scene, and a lot of them began using feathers in their hats. So, I mean, beautiful feathers, but a lot of them were also using whole birds and wings of birds. You couldn't walk down the streets of Boston or New York and not see windows full of headwear, all adorned with feathers or plumage. Well, this led to the unfortunate situation where birds were being decimated strictly for millinery purposes. In Florida alone, 90% of the white egrets were killed, just for millinery. So in 1896, there were two cousins. I think you mentioned something earlier. There were two cousins. Their last names were Hall and Hemingway. And they got together. They began hosting tea parties. They were part of Boston's Blue Blood Society. So they began hosting these parties and asking women to boycott any milliners that made hats out of feathers. A lot of the women joined, some didn't, but because of their efforts, the Massachusetts Audubon Society was born. Wow. So that came about because of hats. And in addition to the Mass Audubon Society, of course, over time, we got the National Audubon Society. There were also other laws, migratory bird treaty law, which was against the law to take birds across state lines. So all of that was to help prevent millinery. And also in the late 1800s, there was a play written for a stage actress. Anybody familiar with the name Sarah Bernhardt?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So Sarah Bernhardt was in a play, and in the play, she wore a soft felt-styled hat. Her name in the play was Princess Fedora. So this style of hat became known as a fedora. So fedoras were actually made and marketed for women before they were made for men. And then, of course, we roll into 1920. 1920s, women earn the right to vote. They start to feel a little bit of freedom. they cut their hair short. They start wearing a style of hat that's called a cloche, and it fits snugly on their head with their new hairstyles. The men, in around 1924, there was a prince in England, and he liked the style of the fedora. So he wanted it, this is not from 1924, but he wanted a more manly version, and it was designed for him, and his subjects, of course, emulated him. And the fedora took off in popularity for men in the 20s, and they even made them for children. So the men, if you think, watching TV shows, I always refer to that, you can picture the gangsters, like an Al Capone, Prohibition, and they're all wearing fedoras. This is probably one of the most popular hats in history. And throughout these times, as I mentioned earlier, there were different milliners that made hats. It wasn't just certain ones. They had different styles, different designs, and I'm only going to mention 3 of them to you that stand out, I think. So one of them was Elsa Schiaparelli. Elsa, can you tell she was Italian? Yeah. Elsa was born in Italy. She actually opened her first shop in the late 20s in France, in Paris. She did a lot with surrealism. She did a lot of work with Dali. And in fact, initially she didn't do just millinery. She did dresses. She was the first person to put a zipper on the outside of a dress and to color it. So if you had a yellow dress, you had a yellow zipper. She made it part of the outfit. She wore a dress that she had Dali paint a giant lobster on. And she came out with the color known as shocking pink, and eventually a perfume of that name was developed. So she was very innovative, and she did a lot with styles. She was considered the top designer between the 2 world wars. And Elsa also made a high heel shoe hat, where she put the high heel upside down on your head, and it literally looked like a high heel, but it was a hat. So she did a lot with Dali. That was done with him as well. And then in 1939, when France declared war on Germany, Elsa fled to the States. She lived in the States with her husband. They had a daughter. Eventually, they did move back to France. She had gotten divorced, and she reopened her shop, but it never really took off again. Not the way it was. In fact, she ended up closing it in the early 50s. There was a milliner, Christian Dior, on the scene, and he did a lot with like a turban style. So unfortunately, Elsa closed her shop. But in 2012, the name Schiaparelli was repurchased. Elsa had since passed away, but the name was brought back to life. Now she had, I mentioned a daughter. Her daughter had 2 daughters. One of them actually married Anthony Perkins from the Psycho movie. Oh, yeah. The other one was a photographer, and she unfortunately didn't get to see her family name brought back to the forefront of fashion because Elsa's granddaughter was on vacation down the Cape and was flying home to California when her plane hit the World Towers. That always breaks me up, but she was killed on September 11th, Elsa's granddaughter. On a happier note, another milliner at the time, who, while Elsa was closing her shop in the 50s, he was still very prominent. His name was Mr. John. Now, Mr. John was considered the milliner to the stars. He designed hats for Vivian Leigh, Greta Garbo. He did Gone with the Wind. And I like to mention Mr. John because I found him rather amusing. One of my favorite stories of him, he had a woman come into his shop in New York, and she demanded a hat made immediately. She had a special event. She wanted something special, but she needed it now. So he sat her down, and he literally built the hat upon her head. When he was done, he told her the price. Well, she looked at him, and she complained. She said, "That's too much money." He said, "Hold on." He disassembled the whole hat. He handed her the pieces. He said, $3.59, you build it.
Oh, wow.
When Mr. John died at the age of 91 in 1993, He was quoted as saying, "I don't know what I'll do when I get to heaven because I don't think even I can improve on the halo." The last milliner I like to mention, her name is Ann Dinkin. And is anyone familiar with Bonwit and Teller? Okay. It's kind of, I compared it to a Macy's. But Ann worked for, no? Not like a Macy's? Oh, really? Well, thank you for correcting that.
Very high end, very high end.
Oh, well, we learned something new today. That's my brother.
Do you remember parking at Bonwit Tellers and walking through the store and then going off to another part of?
I'm
That's
sorry,
what
say,
you could do. You could park at Bonwit. Does anybody remember that?
so
You
they
could
were in
park at
Boston.
Bonwit Tellers for free.
Yeah, they were at Berkeley, between Berkeley.
Yeah.
Oh,
Where
okay.
Where Restoration Hardware is today.
Oh, really?
And that was what everybody did. You just went into the store and then pretended you were shopping, then walked out the front.
Oh, what a
And you had free
riot.
parking. Yeah, yeah.
I like your style. So, okay then, now I got a schooling. So my mom actually got me this, and she got it at a yard sale. Now, she worked at Bonwit and Teller in New York, Ann did. And when the war ended, World War II ended, her and her husband, he got one of the very few visas to move to Japan. And he was actually selling transistor radios back to the States and making a lot of money. Well, him and Ann Dinkin got divorced. And the cool thing about what I really love about this hat, by the way, is that it came with the provenance. When they moved to Japan, Ann was still making hats and selling them back to the States. And this one, in her writing, it says, "I can get you a fine bonnet, my love, if you'll choose the one you like." And the one that I have is checked off here. So for the price of the hat and the shipping from Japan, it was $18.
Which was a lot of money then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, just to put that in perspective now, this hat here was $450 with no shipping.
Wow.
But so anyways, Ann was selling her hats back to the States. Her and her husband got divorced. So it's around 1965. Ann needs to make a little bit more money to sustain herself. Selling a few pieces of headwear back to the States isn't going to do it. So my daughter and I were doing all this research, trying to get information about Ann Dinkin. That's part of the fun, is researching some of this. And all that kept coming up was Jewish delicatessen owner. And I couldn't figure out why we couldn't find anything about the milliner. And come to find out, it's the same person. So when Ann decided she needed to make more money, what she did was she opened Japan's one and only Jewish delicatessen. And she convinced the ministry in Japan to give her exclusive rights to import pastrami. So she had no competition.
Wow.
She then told reporters that she trained her employees to be rude to the customers so nobody else would hire them. And she wanted people to have that real New York experience. So throughout throughout the 20s, the 30s, up to the 50s, headwear is still a very important part of people's day. We put on socks, they'd put on it, they wouldn't leave without a hat. This happens to be a photo from the 50s that these kids are going to a circus, and yet the adult chaperones, the children, so many of them are wearing hats. And my mother would kill me because she's in this picture. And she hates, I said, Mom, I promise I won't show the one where you tease your hair up, but I am showing this one. But it's just amazing to me that they're all wearing headwear. And this is in the 50s. Well, then we start rolling into the 1960s. And women start to tease their hair, color their hair. That's now becoming their fashion statement rather than putting on a hat. In fact, I call these lazies, but they're actually called whimsies. If remember, you want to cover your head going into church, well, this was as far as they went at this point. They also attribute some of the downfall of headwear, if you will, to the new president of the United States, President Kennedy. He was not a fan of headwear. In fact, they have the hat associations were holding meetings, and daily they were sending future president, they were sending him hats, hoping he'd wear one for a photo op, but he never would. And when he was on the campaign trail, it started to rain. He stepped into a store and he bought a hat, and the front page of the paper the next day, Jack bought a hat. So it really was a big deal for him to put on anything like that. Of course, his wife, you remember wearing the Jackie Kennedy style hats, the beautiful pillbox styles. So those were still popular with her. But the 60s, very much a decline, and by the 1970s, there was not a lot of need or want for headwear, men or women. What changed that in the 80s? 1981, there was a movie that came out with Harrison Ford, and he wore a fedora. Anybody know the name of the movie? What? Yes, Indiana Jones. In fact, the hat from the second Indiana Jones movie, the fedora, just sold for $630,000.
Oh, my goodness.
So this is just an article about it, but $630,000 for a fedora. So in the 80s, men's fashion, the fedora is back in mainstream for society. I mean, it was very, very popular, and it's still worn today, as you can see over here on my model. So the men start wearing fedoras, but what do you think brought headwear back for women? There was a certain princess on the scene. Yes, Princess Diana. She was very much a people person, and the women wanted to emulate her, of course, and she wore the most beautiful hats. I mean, a lot of Europe's royalty does, but she really brought it to the forefront, being young, and got the younger people to wear them. So in the 80s, headwear started taking off again. And some people say, oh, it's old-fashioned, but if you think now, TV shows came on, like Mad Men and Downton Abbey, and they all brought fashion back with headwear. You look in magazines, almost any woman's magazine now, the women are wearing hats. The Met Gala, I mean, that's a huge event in New York, and they all have these fancy hats. We went to a hat show years ago, my boyfriend and I was wearing a black hat with some stuff on it, and a woman came over to me, and she said, oh, you're wearing my hat. And it was Cha-Cha, one of my favorite current designers. These are actually her hats, as is the one he's wearing. But her company name is Cha-Cha's House of Ill Repute. So I was doing a talk for a church one night, and I said that, and I realized there was a big cross of Jesus behind me. I turned around and said, I'm sorry, but these are Cha-Cha's hats, and I just thought it was so cool meeting her that night. And yes, they do have, it was at a hat association dinner in New York. They actually have people from all around the world that make hats, and even the hat boxes, they were all at the event. I was just there because I liked hats. But, so I always tell people, you look great in hats, they're becoming popular again, and of course when you wear a hat, it's like the first thing people notice. So, okay, maybe the hat wasn't the first thing I noticed, ladies, but eventually I noticed this hat. This was on an airplane in New Zealand, and the gentleman behind me was wearing a New England Patriots hat, and I was so excited, and he had no clue who the New England Patriots were. He said he got it on sale in England. But it was a good conversation starter. And if we have any Patriots fans here, if you remember when they were going to move, before Kraft built the new stadium, the Patriots were going to move to St. Louis and become the Stallions, and they actually made up the hats for it. They were supposed to be destroyed, but at the Patriots Hall of Fame in Foxborough, they do have the shirt on display, but they don't have the hat. So I'm holding out for season tickets. And so I'm going to show you some of the what I think are some cool things in the collection here. Back in the 40s, these are legit, like what the hat boxes would actually look like from these particular companies. We have Resistol and Dobbs. And these are called salesman samples, but what they actually are gift certificates. So you would give the person this hat box, and inside is a little mini hat. And this is what they would now take to the hatter. Luckily, that one's plastic. And they would turn this in and get the hat that was purchased for them. I just think they're the cutest little things. And this one's a little gray fedora. Isn't it? This, exactly. I wish we still did things like this today. But it probably costs more money to make this than the hat, right? So, we also have, well, I thought this was cool. The, again, back to the football. But in the 37th Super Bowl? Okay, Super Bowl 37. They make up the hats for both teams as winners. So they're both Super Bowl 37, but they both show different teams as winning. Anybody know who won it? No. Throw a guess. You got a 50-50 chance. Okay, Tampa Bay won the Super Bowl. But what I found funny was the year before, Oakland fired their coach. Guess where he went? Oh, wow. A little bit of retribution in that one. Now this, somebody knew what these were earlier, they mentioned it. These are very rare because they are Amish bonnets, and when the infant is first born, they put them in a little white cap. And then after that, this grows in size. They're like those Russian nesting dolls. And so they wear the black bonnets until if they get married later in life, they go back to white. But until then, they wear black. And this has the name Amanda written in it. Now, I was at Brimfield Antique Fair, which is going on this week. What's that?
Guess Amanda didn't get married.
I did. Well, maybe she did. That's why she didn't need these anymore. So I was at the antique fair in Brimfield, and I walked into a booth and I saw these. I was like, wow, I've never seen like this. And there was a gentleman in there, and I very casually said, oh, what are these, bonnets? And his answer was, yeah, my wife got those. Who's going to want bonnets? And I went, oh, goody. So I got a really good deal on these. I don't think his wife was too happy with him when she got back. And then my daughter, a few years back, she went on a vacation to Spain. And I told her the only thing I'd like is an authentic, Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish and the Portuguese wear beautiful outfits, and they wear this type of hat, Montero. So she came home, Mom, I looked everywhere. I only could find toy ones. I could not find a real one. And about a year later, I'm at an antique store in Maine, and I find one. And I'm so excited. I brought it home, and my mother is 86 years old. She still works full time. So I brought it home. I showed this to my mom, and she looks at it and she says, why did you buy Mickey Mouse ears? I can't tell that with her hair because she'd get upset. But I thought that was funny. This one is Iroquois Indian, and it's all hand embroidered and hand beaded. This is from the late 1800s. Wow. And the Iroquois would sell these up around Niagara Falls to the tourists. I mean, there's so much work in it, And I just thought that was beautiful, but. And this one is a Las Vegas showgirl. It's actually a lot heavier than you'd think, but it's all hand beaded and such. It's really pretty, but again, it's pretty heavy. It's heavier than the German World War I helmet. So this is engraved 1915 Berlin. This is called a Pickelhaube, And this is artillery. I'm sorry, this is infantry. If it were artillery, it would have a ball on the top. But that's, and it's, I mean, that's a pretty rare helmet. It still has the liner in it. Now, does anybody know what these are? What is it?
Fraternity hat?
Very good. Yes, these are they'd call them dinks or just college beanies. I brought, this is my alma mater, Stonehill, but in it is a gentleman wearing one of these. And they think the demise, well, the freshmen would wear them. And then the upperclassmen could question them about the school and such and make them do stupid things if they got the answers wrong. And then when the gentlemen were coming back from war, and there was no way they were putting one of these on, right? So. Okay, this one, this is also one of my favorites. This is called a Chinese Mao, M-I-A-O. It's all hand embroidered. When the Mao women are very young, they're taught this intricate embroidery. And it is also adorned with hand-hammered silver, birds and feathers usually, because they're worn for weddings and festivals.
Where did you get it?
That's part of my story. So I'm going to answer your question right now. When I had like just a few minor surgeries, and two of my best friends said, we're going to cheer you up. We're going to take you to Martha's Vineyard for the day. So we went to Martha's Vineyard, and this was in an antique store window. And of course, I fell in love with it. And being my two best friends, they convinced me, look, you don't have the money right now, you really shouldn't get it. So I didn't. I left the island without it. I waited 3 whole days, and then I called my boyfriend and said, hey, you want to go to the vineyard for the day? So we did. I bought the hat. And now fast forward about 10 years later, so it was a few years back, and a new shop moved onto my mail route, which was in Mansfield, Mass. And I'm talking to the woman that owns it. Her name is Leaf Boutique, really cool shop. And she does not pay me for saying that. But we're talking, and of course, I get on the subject of hats. And I'm trying to describe this hat, and she said, oh, I know exactly what hat you're talking about. I even know where you bought it. I said, how can you know that? It was her mother's store in Edgartown that I bought the hat. I know, small world, right? And here she is in Mansfield, Massachusetts. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Okay, this one, we're winding down here, kids. This one was in Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus. It belonged to one of 2 sisters. They were twins. This one was Gloria Hunt. It's a very small photo, but you can see the 2 twins, and they're holding, one of them actually has a feather with this type of green colored hat in it. And, excuse me, but they did acrobats and such for the circus. So my daughter and I, again, we were researching this hat, and we saw the name, there's a name inside, which is a company name in New York that we looked up, and it said they made hats for the circus as well as for theater. So we then crossed like circus with the name of the company and such, and the woman's name is also in the hat, and then popped up the photo.
Wow.
And we knew that this was her. A friend of mine I worked with in Mansfield, he took care of a gentleman that was turned about 100 before he passed away, and he worked his whole life for Ringling Brothers Circus.
Oh my
and
goodness.
yeah, and he left a lot of his belongings to my friend who was his caretaker, and he gave me the hat. So probably have 2 more stories here. Oops. No, just to show you. This was in the movie Jewel of the Nile with Michael Douglas. The bad guys wore it. This always reminds me, though, I love this piece, but it always reminds me of the hat that got away. back when I was probably in my 20s, we were at Universal Studios, and back then you could buy the props, and they weren't 600 and something thousand dollars like Indiana Jones's hat. So you could buy the props, and the one I really wanted that they had was the original Mary Poppins hat but it was $1,000. And in my 20s, I did not have $1,000 for a hat. But I got this one as a consolation. And then a few years ago, for Mother's Day, I have 2 kids, 2 adult kids, and I always wanted, this is a Kent bread hat. So he makes hats that look like cakes and breads and pies. And I had seen this in a magazine, and I told my son, I showed him the picture, and I said, I would love this hat, but they don't ship to the United States. They only sell these in Japan. So for Mother's Day one year, he's very good with the computer, he reached out to the milliner that makes these hats and sent him the photo that I had showed him in the magazine and had him make the hat for me. Then he had it shipped to a shipping company in Japan, and him and my daughter chipped in, and it arrived on Mother's Day a few years ago, and I was so excited. So, yeah, they are good kids. And I'd just like to show fascinators. People are familiar with fascinators. These are really cool fascinators. But in fact, when Prince Harry got married, he put on the invitations that the women must wear either a hat or a fascinator. And these are big now at the Kentucky Derby. In addition to hats, they also wear fascinators.
That's awesome with the butterfly.
So, yeah, this one was from Boston, this one here. And this is a woman up in Newburyport.
They wear them up in Saratoga Springs, too.
Yes, yes, right, the race?
The track, yeah.
Yes, yes. In fact, the Kentucky Derby, that started in 1875, but they've been wearing headwear since the very beginning because they brought it from the Epsom Derby in England, which women were always known for wearing the headwear at. Okay, this one. This is by Donna Davis, and it's all metal with the Swarovski crystals.
That's wild. I'm dying to see that.
I know, sometimes I forget to show this one because it's on the floor, but.
Oh, God, it's beautiful.
So it's got a little bit of weight to it. This was at, I went to the Fashion School of Design. I didn't go there. I didn't take classes there. I went to an event there. I had done a hat presentation, and one of the person that heads the millinery department invited me to come to the school. They were going to have a Christmas party. And she said, would you like to come? I said, sure, a party, I'm in. And so they were auctioning off different things that various milliners had donated, and this was one of them. All right, kids, winding down to the end. So I got 5 minutes. So my last story. I always save this for last. This is my favorite. My dad gave me this hat many, many years ago. My dad he was on vacation in Bermuda, and big Italian guy. And he went up to a police officer there, and he asked him, "Where'd you get your hat?" And the police officer said, "Well, they're issued to us, let's say Mr. Smith, by Mr. Smith at the Armory." So my father said, "Oh, all right." Well, he hailed a cab, and he told the cabbie, "I need to go to the Armory." And the cabbie said, "Well, I'm not allowed to bring you there. That's off limits." My father said, "Well, how far can you get me?" He said, "Well, I can probably get you to the gate." Okay. So Dad got in the back of the cab, and off they went to the Armory. Well, they come up to the gate, and the security guard comes out with the machine gun over his shoulder and walks over to the cab, and there's my dad in the back seat, rolling, because I can picture him telling me the story, rolling down the window, and the gentleman with the machine gun says, "What can I do for you?" And my father says, "Well, I'm here to see Mr. Smith. I'm Joe Muratori from the United States of America." "Oh, all right." Well, they let him in. So my father's telling me this. He says, as we're driving through, He says, I can see the sweat beating up on the cabbie's neck as he's saying, I can't be in here. And my father says, don't worry about it. They just let us in. Well, they come up to a second gate. It's the same scenario. Mr. Muratori from the United States of America. I'm here to see Mr. Smith. And the second gentleman, also with the machine gun, opens the gate and lets them in. So now they come to the base of the stairs of the armory, and my dad says to the cabbie, just wait here. I'll make it worth your while. Just wait for me. So Dad goes inside, and he greets the secretary. She greets him, and she says, oh, all right, Mr. Muratori, have a seat. He'll be right with you. A few minutes go by. She comes out, gets my dad, says, Mr. Smith, we'll see you now. So he goes into the office, and they exchange pleasantries, and Mr. Smith says, well, what can I do for you? And my father says, well, I'd like to buy a police hat for my daughter's hat collection. And Mr. Smith looks at him and says, how did you get in here? And my father says, they let me in at the gate. So Mr. Smith says, for the sheer fact that you were able to get in here today, I am going to get you a police hat. And my dad, not being pushy, or with a badge and everything. And Mr. Smith says, yes, with a badge and everything. I can't just hand it to you, but I'm going to give you a piece of paper. Fill out all your information, and there will be a hat waiting for you at customs. So my father thanks him, and then my father says, well, I really appreciate that. What can I do for you? And Mr. Smith said, Mr. Muratori, you've done more than enough. You taught me I need to upgrade my security system. So, and I'd just like to leave it on the last note that you should go out and buy hats, because everybody looks good in them. But when you do, buy it when you're sober, or you might think you look good in one of these. So, thank you. You guys were awesome.